Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 539th New Social Environment. I'm Nick, the Director of Programs here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation on Guernica, the survival of a myth, featuring esteemed art historians and curators Hedy Chambers, Pepe Karmel, José Lebrero Stals, Caroline Levitt, Tom Mitchell, and Phyllis Tuchman, all in conversation with Natalia Gierowska. We're thrilled to welcome Sarah Heady here to close today's program with a poetry reading. Before we get started, the Brooklyn Rail acknowledges that Black Lives Matter and that here in New York, we are on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We encourage you to check the chat for a living document of resources and actions that we'll post in just a moment. Over the past 22 years, the Brooklyn Rail has undertaken a miraculous journey, bringing together in a single monthly publication art, music, dance, film, theater, and literature, along with thoughtful social and political meditations. As a small nonprofit, we do need your support. Your contribution will directly support our writers, guest artists, production staff, and operations here at the Rail. Please check the chat for more information. Now it is my great pleasure to introduce today's guests and host. Art historian Hedy Chambers is the holder of the David Bruton Jr. Centennial Professorship in Art History at the University of Texas at Austin, where he has taught African Diaspora art history since 2010. He is editor-in-chief of CAA's Art Journal. Pepe Karmel teaches in the Department of Art History at New York University and is the author of Picasso and the Invention of Cubism and curated the exhibition Dialogues with Picasso at the Museo Picasso Malaga in 2020. José Lebrero Stals has been the artistic director of the Museo Picasso Malaga since 2009. Caroline Levitt is currently head of the History of Art Department and a member of the Teaching and Research Faculty at the Courtauld Institute of Art in London. She is a regular contributor to the Courtauld's public programs, including summer school, study tours, and the Showcasing Art History lecture series. Tom Mitchell is senior editor of the interdisciplinary journal Critical Inquiry. He is known especially for his work on the relations of visual and verbal representation in the context of social and political issues. Phyllis Tuchman wrote her master's thesis for the Institute of Fine Arts, NYU, on Guernica, L'Humanité, and the Spanish Pavilion. A condensed version ran an art forum in April 1983. She has published many reviews and articles on Picasso, the most recent on Picasso's Women of Algiers for Gagosian Quarterly. And last but certainly not least, our host for the day, journalist and scholar Natalia Gierowska, is a regular contributor here at the Rail. And without further ado, over to you, Natalia.
Nick, thank you for the introduction, and I'm delighted to host today's panel, where I'll be joined by leading historians, art historians, critics, and curators. Before we begin, I think it's necessary to set the scene for our discussion upon which our panelists will build. On the 5th of April, 2022, the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, addressed the UN Security Council and analogized the devastation in Ukraine with an episode of brutality during the Spanish Civil War. He said, "It is April 2022, but it seems like April 1937, when the whole world heard about one of your cities, Guernica." As the drumbeat of war gets louder in Ukraine, Pablo Picasso's Guernica once again is injected with new relevance and duty. With the return of Guernica tapestry to the UN headquarters this February and the resurfacing of the image as a totem of the Eastern European art struggle, the return of the canvas to our shared post-World War II consciousness is both literal and metaphorical. Picasso's Guernica was born out of very particular socio-political circumstances. The canvas was a reaction to the rise of National Socialism that swept across the country under the lead of General Franco throughout the 1930s. However, more specifically, it was a reaction and response to the bombing of Guernica by the German Air Force in 1937, which reduced the Basque city to a smoldering ruin. The Spanish Republic employed the canvas to condemn and vilify Franco and the nationalists, and it became appropriated as a political statement and a powerful tool of propaganda. In its sharp delineation of anguish and desperation, Guernica moved away from representing a critique of very Spanish-specific problems and turned into an international image of global political issues. How does Guernica, comprised only of 3 canvases, project such a potent, hyper-visible social commentary on fascism and war overall? What gives Guernica this symbolic power, and how should we interpret the painting? In 1947, Alfred Barr, the then director of MoMA, organized a symposium to resolve the conundrum of Guernica's true meaning. Barr opened the panel with the following pronouncements. The controversy about Guernica has been waged about 2 questions. First, what is the value of the painting in the light of Picasso's intention? And second, what is the detailed symbolic meaning of the painting? Today, these conundrums remain as ad rem as ever, as no single explanation has prevailed. Well, the motivation for our panel talk corresponds to the forces that inspired the creation of the Guernica Symposium in 1947. Whilst we will not try and attempt to settle once and for all the vexed question of Guernica's true meaning, we will, however, provide a platform where leading art historians will share their exhaustive reflections on the iconic canvas and its new role in the context of the Ukrainian conflict. With that in mind, I'll explain the structure of our talk. The round table will consist of 2 elements. The first component of the panel is a scaled down adaptation of the Guernica Symposium that took place in November 2021 at the Picasso Museum in Malaga, planned by the museum's artistic director, José Lebrero Stals. Our expert speakers, that is Eddie Chambers, Pepe Karmel, Carolyn Levitt, and Tom Mitchell, will tackle the questions that are at the heart of the Guernica discussion. For the second half of the roundtable, we'll be joined by Picasso expert Phyllis Tuchman, the Brooklyn Rail's editor-at-large for art criticism. And we will consider Guernica's relevance and revival against the backdrop of the intensifying conflict on the Ukrainian soil. With unfolding more the East, it is worth re-examining and the purpose of Picasso's canvas, and pose the question whether a century later, it is still as germane to contemporary struggles as it has been during the Spanish Civil War that ultimately paved the way for the brutality of World War II. I would like to welcome Professor Tom Mitchell, who will deliver a lecture entitled The Other Lives in Guernica to begin and open our panel.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Natasha. I'm very honored to be part of this conversation, and it's kind of an amazing moment to think about Guernica in relation to contemporary history. Of course, it's widely known what its historical meaning is, but we're making new history right now as we speak. At the symposium last fall, I said something extremely incautious and somewhat controversial, namely, Guernica asks nothing of us. It has nothing to offer. It has been fully absorbed into the canon as a modernist icon. Needless to say, I don't expect anybody in this symposium to agree with that. Rather, I want to take it as a provocation to please show me what its relevance is today, other than being a kind of ready-made icon of anti-war sentiment, and perhaps even anti-militarism, which is, I think, a larger issue. So let me share my screen. I'm going to do a blitzkrieg of slides very quickly. Okay, I hope this is sharing properly. So the question before us, what use is Guernica in thinking about Ukraine? And I want to make a distinction between Guernica, the painting, and the image of Guernica. Guernica at Reina Sofia is not going anywhere. It will never travel again. And I don't imagine political demonstrations are going to be launched in front of it. It will simply become the major tourist attraction of Madrid and continue to draw masses of people who will get a glimpse of it for approximately 30 seconds before being pushed onward by the guards. What I'm interested in is the afterlives of Guernica, the innumerable parodies, satires, reproductions, and the lives of the images that populate Guernica, including, to my mind, most strangely, Picasso's contemporary images of bullfights. But in between then and now, Guernica has become part of the poster art of the average undergraduate dormitory room, as Celeste P. Spencer shows in this particular image. That is, a fragment of it is taped up to the wall alongside other images illustrating your political position. What kind of work is it doing there? Other than reassurance that, yes, my heart is in the right place, I'm against war. There's also recyclings of this sort, probably the most scandalous in history. The Bundeswehr used it as an ad for the peacekeeping mission of the German military, much to the outrage of Günter Grass and many others. The image, in other words, can be recycled for almost any purpose to support any cause. And the irony of it being an advertisement for the German army is a little bit too much. To me, one of the prominent moments when Guernica realized its potential for political intervention was in 1970, when at the Museum of Modern Art, the Art Workers Coalition brought in photographs of the My Lai massacre. In other words, they brought Guernica home. They made us face it. And I think as a tourist object, you rarely face it. As a study object, we scholars spend a lot of time. But this was one moment canonized by Studio International at the time. There's also more disturbing activations of the painting when it was defaced by Tony Shafrazi in 1974, probably in relation to the same issues, that Guernica had become a kind of icon of American, not anti-war, but just a possession of American hegemony and an assurance that everything's all right with us, the enemy is elsewhere. This was reinforced at the moment of the onset of the Iraq War, when it was necessary to cover it up, because it would have been embarrassing when Colin Powell walked into the United Nations and presented a slide lecture which claimed that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq and launched one of the most disastrous military misadventures of the US. So these are the kind of interventions where Guernica played a role that speak to my heart and my political instincts. They don't present Guernica as reassuring us of our moral virtue. They actually make us face it a new way, as in this image of another atrocity, ongoing atrocity. I mean, Ukraine is terrible. It's unspeakable. But the destruction of cities by Western democracies goes on constantly. When does Guernica have to be brought out to confront these moments, and why? What is in Guernica that makes it unique or special? We have been hunting for Guernica a long time. People have been, and I particularly love this photograph of the Las Falas de la Valencia from 1979, which I translate as the hunt for the painting. I take it that in 1979, the battle was to release it from MoMA and get it back to Spain, where Spaniards felt it belonged, and MoMA was holding out. There was resistance to returning the painting. Here you see men with rifles gathered in front of the painting, as if they are hunting for it to bring it home. So what pictures are relevant to Ukraine at this moment? I want to offer two, and then I'll wrap up. One is, and this is a painting by my friend Luca Del Baldo, Italian artist, showing, it's called Brothers in Arms, and it is the head of Russia's Orthodox Church shaking hands with Putin. I think of it as an allegory of the obscene alliance between religion and war. It also introduces something that is clearly absent from Guernica, absent from 1937, that is the horizon of the current conflict, and that is the possibility that World War III may have already been launched. Putin is already threatening to install nuclear arms on the borders of Finland. And every day, just today, the CIA released reports indicating he may try them out in Ukraine as well. So the use of new military technologies, for the last 60 years, war has been framed inside of this ever since World War II. And since the US created the most unspeakable Guernicas of all time in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So does Guernica speak to that? Well, let me show you Luca's other painting of this moment. And this is his painting of the selfie in which Vladimir Zelensky informed us that he needed a rifle, not a ride. He needs help resisting the Russian invasion. Zelensky has become the iconic figure of our moment. And I think Luca was very clever to render this in painting, to make it clear what his status is. Can you remember, since perhaps Nelson Mandela, a figure who has garnered more global respect and introduced a bigger moment of moral clarity than Vladimir Zelensky? The man is extraordinary, courageous, charismatic, knowing what to say, and he is mobilizing the world. He's also, the fact that it was a selfie, to me, makes an uncanny connection between the handshake of war and religion on the one hand, and his reaching out to the world. It never occurred to me before that every selfie is a pictorial handshake because you see the arm extended toward the viewer. So these to me are if you're looking for paintings to capture the moment, yes. What is Guernica doing? I challenge you to explain to me what use it has beyond a very generalized, oh, isn't this terrible again? And I want to say this particularly, emphasizing the word again, because one detail of Guernica has always disturbed me. Everybody talks about it as a scene of mass death, but one creature is alive and well, and that is the bull who looks back at us. If you look at the drawings, Picasso swiveled him so that his face moves more toward the center. He's the unmoved spectator. And the fact that he's alive and well is suggested by that tail, which is waving in the air behind him. What is the bull? The obvious answer is he's a symbol of masculinity, of male violence, and of the kind of conflict that political leaders produce when they begin to assume macho postures. I'm afraid the US has behaved I think this war didn't have to happen, in other words. I feel the US could have negotiated much more cleverly and said, they'll never come into NATO, they'll never be a threat to you. But instead, there was this dance of words. The word never means nothing in politics or diplomacy, and it could have been promised with a straight face. So I hope my colleagues will answer my questions. First, what use is Guernica now? And what is the bull doing? Thanks very much.
Thank you, Professor Mitchell. That was terrific. We'll now go into the next presentation. Our next speaker is Professor Pepe Karmel, who will present a lecture titled Guernica and Contemporary Art.
Thank you, Natalia. So Nick, if you could pull up the beginning of my PowerPoint, I want to deal with Guernica obliquely and at first glance in a very, art-focused way. I mean, Tom's talk was so terrific. It was the first version I heard last November was terrific and terrific all over again today. And you've raised such important questions about politics and morality around the painting. It feels a little embarrassing to talk about art qua art, but I hope to lead back to the larger questions. So one of the things, when I started thinking about Guernica and contemporary art, one of the things that struck me is that on the one hand, there are all of these pastiches, remakes, parodies, invoking it in various ways, but there's also a group of works that pick up the themes of Guernica without necessarily repeating the imagery. And so what I want to do in the next few minutes is to look at a few of these themes as they've been explored in different ways by contemporary artists. Nick, if we could go to the next image, please. So the first theme I want to look at is the theme of victims, which Tom has already talked about, and on to the next image. Nick, thanks. We see this primarily in the part of the painting that Tom just showed us, with the woman at left cradling what seems to be a dead child, the dead man on the ground, the horse howling in pain. And of course, there are other figures who are screaming with fear, positioned around the painting. About the bull, to try to respond to the question that was just raised, there's been a debate around it since the Alfred Barr panel that Natalia mentioned. It's been interpreted in contradictory ways. Picasso on some occasions said that it was a symbol of the long-suffering Spanish people who were the victims of the violence of Franco's forces. On other occasions, it's been argued convincingly that it's a representation of the phalange, of fascism, of toxic masculinity, and so forth. I don't think there's ever going to be a definitive answer to that question. But to go beyond Picasso, Nick, we can go to the next image, thanks. Contemporary artists have addressed this sense of, tragic victimhood in radically different ways. So one of the most impressive, I think, is this installation by Christian Boltanski, where he simply took a bunch of clothes he bought in secondhand stores and spread them out in the nave of a cathedral, suggesting a multitude of bodies that used to inhabit these clothes, people who have vanished. As always with Boltanski's work, there's a unnerving mixture of what seem to be references to the Holocaust, but at the same time an invocation of Catholic imagery. If we can go to the next again. This is a much less well-known work that I learned about, in fact, from a Turkish graduate student, an installation that was put in place in 1995 in a train station in Anatolia. This is what it is fabrics, stiffened fabrics that seem to show bodies under them, as though a series of people had died, their bodies have been laid out on the floor, and then they've been covered with dark blankets. And this was installed by a group of artists in response to the ongoing conflict between the KKK, which is officially a kind of terrorist group supporting Kurdish independence, and the Turkish government. There had been a momentary truce in this war, a moment of hope when it seemed like the Turkish government was prepared to recognize the aspirations of the Kurds. Thank you, Hedy, for the correction. Of course, it's the PKK. The Turkish government was prepared to recognize some of the aspirations of the Kurds to be able to enjoy their own culture, to get democratic representation, and then everything fell apart, and there were massacres actually committed by both sides. So this sense simply of loss, pointless, tragic loss, is something that was, evoked by this momentary installation, which was very rapidly cleared away by the authorities as upsetting people. Nick, if we could go to the next, please. Then there's the theme, which I already mentioned, of lamentations. And if we can go forward again, here we see, again, the figures, the weeping woman on the left, another one on the right. What are the contemporary counterparts to this? Well, just to pick one example, because time is short, Nick, if we can go forward again. I was thinking of Bastian Adler's famous performance, which exists as a series of photographs I'm too sad to tell you, which, as it happens in its immediate, the pose, the hand on the head, the tears, oddly echoes Picasso's many images of a weeping woman, which, it should be noted, were done after Guernica. Sometimes I think we fall into the habit of thinking that Picasso was obsessed with Dora Maar as a weeping woman and that fed into the painting. But in fact, this theme of profound grief and despair expressed through weeping emerges after the painting. It takes on a personal aspect after its social aspect. And Bastian Adder's photograph, well, first performance, which actually did several times and photographed several times, again, is deliberately ambiguous. We don't know what he's too sad about, and he's too sad to tell us. We know that something terrible has occurred, but we don't know what it is. And I think this expands into a more general sense. Is it personal? Is it social? Is it political? What is the event that has provoked this seemingly unendurable grief? So let's hold that thought for a moment. And Nick, if we could go forward again. Now I want to come back to the theme of resistance, which of course seems, very important. Thanks, Nick. At this moment in time, and I want to point out something that was evident in some of those photographs Nick was showing while Natalia was speaking of the early states of Guernica. Originally, the fallen warrior at the bottom of the painting was, first of all, he was facing the other way, but with the same gesture of clutching a broken sword. But he had an arm raised, a fist raised, a metaphorical suggestion that even though he had died, the resistance would go on. And this cry to resistance, to fighting back, to the hope of triumph, even after immediate defeat. And that gesture also played a key role in a painting that was done at the same time, on the same occasion as Guernica, which is the painting on the right, Madrid, 1937, by Horacio Ferrer de Morgado, which records not the tragedy of Guernica, but in fact a similar event that is not so well remembered, which is the bombing of Madrid earlier, and the way that parts of the city were destroyed. Many people were killed. And so here we see a group of grieving mothers responding to this horrible bombardment, but one of them is visibly shaking her fist. The symbol here of the bared breast, I think, is an extension of the Caritas Romanas theme that you also see, for instance, in Delacroix's Liberty on the Barricades. And so it's interesting that Ferrer de Morgado preserved this gesture, call to resistance, in his painting, and Picasso got rid of it. It should also be noted that at the time, critics didn't necessarily prefer the Picasso. There was a lot of negative criticism of Guernica, and there were apparently people who suggested that Guernica should be taken down, and Ferrer de Morgado's painting should be made the centerpiece of the Spanish Pavilion at the World's Fair in '37. But let's go forward, Nick, if we can go forward again. So echoes of this in contemporary art. I think there's a brilliant ambiguity in this famous painting by Fan Lijun, the contemporary Chinese artist, that seems to show a crowd of people demonstrating, raising fists in anger, but we don't know who they are. We don't know what they're protesting. In the context of China at the end of the 20th century, we don't know if this is meant to remind us of the anger and destruction of the Cultural Revolution. Are these pro-Maoists protesting against supposed, bourgeois saboteurs, or are they people protesting against the Cultural Revolution itself? Fang quite deliberately doesn't tell us what he's trying to say. He just lets us know that there is this anger and this protest going on. And if we could go forward again. As I said, Picasso gets rid of this. This is the same section of the painting. As you can see, the raised arm has vanished. Where the fist was, there is now this strange light fixture hanging over the town that's also somehow a midnight sun. And above all, there's the image of the horse turning its head and crying out in agony, having been horribly wounded, as we see from the gash in its center. And if we could go forward yet again, please. And I think that there's an affinity here between Picasso's, not statement is the wrong word somehow, but his decision to get rid of the call to resistance, to concentrate exclusively on the suffering and on the tragedy and the sense of horror, and a very odd, not terribly well-known piece by the Dutch artist Mark Bijl, who picked up the phrase from Bastiaan Adder, "I'm too sad to tell you," and rewrote it as a graffito saying, "I'm too sad to kill you." And this is something that has also been echoed in other works by Turkish artists, I mean, leading back into the piece I showed a moment ago. And I think this serves as a kind of salutary warning about the way that, horror and grief all too easily turn to rage. And when people, gather their forces to fight against evil, we've seen too many revolutions where things broke up into little militias, and then they ended up, you end up with long civil wars. Look at, Libya today, look at the history of the Nicaragua, look at the history of Colombia. I don't think this is going to happen in Ukraine. I'm not going to be pessimistic about that. But where I'd like to conclude is with coming back to the importance of staying at the moment of the recognition of tragedy, and to point out that one of the key turning points in the global response to the tragedy in Ukraine was the discovery of the massacres in Bucha. That up to that point, there were political analyses like those that Tom alluded to, pointing out that to some extent the problem of the situation there was not exclusively of Russia's doing, that Obama positioned cruise missiles on the borders of Russia in this part of the world, that we had actually quietly engaged in very provocative actions. And there was a lot of talk about, well, what if we pulled back our missiles? A sort of recognition that maybe, we could come to a deal with Putin if what he really wanted was us to withdraw the things we had done a few years ago. The massacres changed that. It became perfectly clear that it was good versus evil, that the willingness to murder large numbers of civilians was something that put the Russian actions, Putin's actions, beyond the pale of what was acceptable, and has brought together a coalition in support of Ukraine. And I think that spirit, the focus on the fate of civilians, is really the key takeaway from the painting today, and its relevance to the present. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Karmel, for this wonderful lecture. Professor Caroline Levitt will now share with us her presentation on Guernica.
Hello, thank you. I think Nick is going to share my slides for me. So I'll just let him bring those up. But it's a real pleasure to be able to join you today. And it's a joy in some respects to be revisiting the panel from November, although how much has changed since we first met in Malaga to think about this. And I think that has to make a difference perhaps to the way in which we talk about this painting now. So my paper actually centers really on one particular aspect of the composition, and it's this detail that I've put onto that title slide there. But I wonder if we could just move on to the next slide and zoom back out again for a moment. So the thing that I'm interested in is the horse in the middle. And if you have looked at this painting close up, or if you've looked at it carefully, then you'll notice all of the little stubby marks there on the surface of the horse. And they're only on the horse, really, they're not anywhere else. And I think I got into thinking about what these might stand for and why that particular aspect of texture might be important to Picasso's composition. And for me, it's really central, actually, to the way in which this picture becomes constantly retranslatable and reusable. So we'll go into it a little bit and try and decipher what it is that stands for. So in one way, I think that this is purely an attempt at inserting some texture and some life into the enormous, momentous canvas that Picasso is painting. If you paint a series of entirely flat planes with no texture, then it starts to lose its liveliness. And so on one level, Picasso uses texture in a variety of places. And if we can just go back a slide actually and zoom back out again just for a moment, you can see this in various places. There's the web of lines that kind of converges on the left hand of that figure that's laying down, which I think in the chat has already been referred to as a form of crucifixion and a stigmata on that palm, which I think is absolutely right. You You could look to the striped clothing of the nursing mother or sort of Pieta figure, again on the left-hand side, or the individual hairs inscribed on the female figure's heads and the bull's tail, or the roof tiles above the arm which bears the candlestick. These are all examples of texture that Picasso is interested in this picture. If we just go back on again for me for a moment and onto the slide after that one, thank you. In some ways, I think these textures are recalling the surface materials that Picasso is using in Cubism. If we go all the way back, Pepe has just taken us forwards, but if we go all the way back to 1913, in many ways, I think Picasso is using some of the same devices in paint in 1937 as he was using in the papier collé of 1912 to 1913, for example. Now here's the Bon Marché, which includes wallpaper in the background, newsprint, little tickets, pieces of text taken from brands. The Bon Marché is a department store. There's a section of a book at the left-hand corner there, a wide variety of different materials on display in that picture. And if you just move on one slide again for me, actually it was texture that was really important when the canvas was translated into a tapestry. And as we know, this tapestry was taken out of the UN headquarters amongst some confusion last year. It has now been returned, apparently as a result of having been cleaned, and is now hanging back in the United Nations. I don't know if we can maybe see that as some kind of preempting of the need to speak against war again, or whether that's reading too much into it, whether it was just removed for cleaning in a genuine way. But I'm sure there are things we could say about that particular timing of the reinstatement of that tapestry. But texture is obviously a really important aspect of a textile, and the different textures on the surface of Picasso's Guernica are something that were very carefully rendered in the translation of that from one medium to another there. Texture often contributes to the appearance of three-dimensionality in artworks, but Picasso often uses it, I think, to kind of reinforce flatness, to highlight the tensions between illusion and reality, to confuse our sense of space, and we know that space is very confused in Guernica. So the texture of an object in the hands of Picasso is often at odds with the thing that it seems to stand for. So we can't read the stubby marks on the horse, for example, or maybe we can read them simply as the hairs on the back of the horse. But it seems that that would be slightly reductive. So I think in many ways, if the other areas of texture in this composition recall decorative papers, we need to sort of turn from what you might think of as texture or textile to perhaps text and context in order to fully appreciate the stubby marks on the horse. So if you could just move on one more slide for me, thank you. I think we've often thought about the sort of the palette of Guernica, the greys, the blacks, the whites, as recalling the newsprint medium through which Picasso would have heard about the events of 1937. That's something which has been very well rehearsed. And we've also thought about that medium as standing for kind of monumentality. The grisaille palette looks a lot like stone monuments, for example. But I'd suggest that those stubby marks actually begin to stand, when we look at them closely, for text more generally. In particular, maybe the large blocks of newsprint that Picasso uses in his papier collé, and that teeter between background surface and contemporary reference points, kind of depending in a way on the scale at which we look at them. If you just move on to the next slide for me. This particular collage has been used a number of times as sort of case in point for that. Are they just areas of the composition? Do we just see those pieces of newsprint as background, or do we read what they say? And we can create a fairly politicized message if we do the latter, depending on whether we stand back or whether we get close up. So this is a debate that has been well rehearsed, but if we start to look at the markings on the back of the horse, we realize that actually Picasso is engaging with his own work in quite an interesting way. He's kind of quoting, I think, in some respects from the papier collé, from Cubism as a genre, as a mode. And he's engaging again with the kind of wordplay that we see in Cubist collages. And actually the whole of Guernica centers, quite literally, the composition centers on a visual pun in the form of this light bulb, which has already been referenced. Bombillia for light bulb, bomba for bomb, which again disrupts that sense of domesticity and familiarity slap bang in the middle of the composition, and sheds light or offers to shed light, presumes to shed light on meaning, but perhaps far from elucidating it, is just confusing it more and more as we start to look at things. If you look down from that, you see the spear wound in the side of the horse. And actually above that, perhaps because it's Good Friday, it's tempting to read that as the spear wound in the side of the crucified victim on the ground. And suddenly all of these figures and these parts become conflated. And I don't know if there's an answer there to what's the bull doing, but maybe the bull is the relieved sacrifice that doesn't have to be made because the crucifixion has taken place. I don't know. There's a perhaps slightly tenuous link, but maybe it's possible. But Picasso condenses all of these different forms of imagery from different sources into his composition, and Cubism, I think, becomes one quite key source. Now, obviously, one of the problems with the text on the horse is that it isn't really text. If you just move on another slide for me, actually 2 slides. I don't want this next one. I think we'll leave this one. Thank you. There's an allusion to be made, perhaps, between the work of somebody like Cy Twombly, whose work often recalls handwriting, and the text on a Picasso like the horse, which looks like newsprint, but then actually when we get close to it, the closer we look, unlike the Bottle of Sue's piece, the more we realize that we can't read. It's illegible and it's slightly frustrating. And I've picked Twombly in particular because Renan Barthes said of his work that often we might call it the elusive field of writing. There's nothing written, and yet the surface seems to be the repository of all writing. It's a form of writing, and yet it's not interpretable. And I think that that's absolutely key here in a way, that what we're given, if you just move on one more slide for me again, what we're given here is a form of writing that simply cannot be read and that sort of frustrates communication. And I think that's a really important theme, actually, in Picasso's thinking about war. Seen close up, these marks actually look a lot more like handwriting. Perhaps they're closer to Twombly than they are to newsprint. We see the sort of gestural quality of them. And that is slightly frustrated, in fact, by the fact that it seems that Picasso even asked Dora Maar to do some of them for him. Perhaps he got fed up with drawing them himself, and he handed over the brush and said, here, you do some. So whilst it might be tempting to read them as Picasso's personal handwriting, actually, they're almost a collaboration. But it does certainly seem like a sort of an individual viewpoint, which riffs on the idea of the newspaper, which is the medium of mass-produced news. Now, I think some of this starts to become quite ominous, particularly in light of sort of censorship and issues like that as we think about Ukraine. Illegible text could stand for all sorts of things, couldn't it? Something that's illegible is unable to communicate. Its communication is frustrated. Perhaps it speaks of the impossibility of expressing the atrocities of suffering or war, or perhaps it speaks to censorship, amongst a variety of other things, I'm sure. But one thing that Barthes seems to suggest in relation to Twombly, at least, is that actually this sort of text, which doesn't have a possible interpretation, has a life to it, which is constantly reinterpretable and therefore constantly retranslatable. Perhaps it's a sort of universal language. In not speaking one single language, it can speak many languages and cut across many possible contexts and situations. And so it's free in its powers of expression. It has a form of agency. And I think that is quite interesting in the light of the various types of communication that we see coming out of Ukraine, coming out of Russia, or not being allowed to exit, for example, and the mediums through which we discover those. Perhaps not always newsprint, perhaps selfies, perhaps social media, other forms of reporting. If you can just move on, maybe 2 slides for me, actually. We'll leave that one. We'll come on to the next one. These are just onto the next one for me. Sorry. Thank you. These are panels of War and Peace that Picasso made after the Second World War. And it strikes me as very interesting, not only that we have horses again, and we could go into the image of the horse quite a lot, I think. Why is the writing on the horse? Perhaps it's a form of equestrian monument with its inscription on the surface of it. I don't know, various ways we could think about that. The horse is certainly a recurring motif. But I particularly wanted to note that if you look at the war panel, for Picasso, war is characterized by the burning of books, the destruction of language, the destruction of communication. And then in peace, we see those activities of reading and writing taking place again on the right-hand side of the canvas. And whilst the woman is reading a book, if you just move on one slide, I have a detail actually. Whilst the woman is reading a book, which again has some elusive text there, lines, which you can't read, the man writing holds the pen in his hand with a blank piece of paper. There's a sort of sense of hope there, something yet to be written, something which is starting again from kind of ground zero in a way. So I think there's something very, redolent about Picasso's use of writing and use of the lack of communication, the frustration of legibility in his images of war, not just in Guernica, but also in these slightly later panels. And I think that strikes me as particularly key to the way in which Guernica has a potential afterlife, that it can constantly be reinterpreted because the language that it uses is not tied down to one particular circumstance, other than its title, which is the only piece of distinct text. It's quite elusive to a variety of different circumstances. Now, I've got a couple of images just to close of ways in which Guernica has been reused on placards in the contexts of a variety of wars and protests. Here's one linked to the Iraq War, where protesters are individually holding fragments of the picture, which have kind of taken on their own life, perhaps been changed slightly. Certainly the dove in the middle has had some texture added. Perhaps these images start to stand for the kind of outcry of individuals, words which speak in a way that protesters are kind of shouting out their individual cries. Open mouths in particular are a key theme here, aren't they? If we just move on one more slide. This one's a banner. And its symbolism is partly in its creation. It was a collaborative process to make this piece, but people also have to stand side by side to hold it. But perhaps one of the most chilling aspects for me, actually, in light of Bucher in particular, is this part where you see that the stubby lines have been transformed into figures. It's almost as though actually, rather than reading them as text, we read them as a tally. Perhaps they are tallies of lives, the kind of innumerable lives that are to be counted, or perhaps worse still, not possibly to be counted. So I think for me, the afterlife of Guernica, what use does it have? It has a use in getting us to think about the way in which war frustrates communication, or perhaps even stems from communication that has failed. And there's another piece in the Vietnam War, which perhaps we won't go into too much now, but I think for me, this is another example of the way that Picasso retains ambiguity. Is this a napalm victim with that sort of aura of white around its arm and its stigmata on its hand, like the crucifixion? Or actually in the amputated neck, should we be seeing the US soldier who's fallen foul of a landmine? Actually, the victim is on both sides, and there are no winners, I think, is one of the suggestions of the way in which this has been reinterpreted. But I think the key thing for me, and its power and its eloquence, lies in its evidence of frustrated communication, its illegibility. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Levitt, for this in-depth analysis of the canvas and the role of writing Picasso's work. And last but not least, Professor Eddie Chambers will present his lecture on Donald Rodney, Soweto, Guernica.
I'm muted. Right, okay, thank you so much. So I'm just going to share my screen quickly. Hopefully that has worked. Has that worked okay? Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much. Right, okay, I'll start. I'm afraid I must begin with an apology. This talk is about an important work by Black British artist Donald Rodney. That was made by the artist in 1988, and the title of the work is Soweto, Guernica. The image of the work I'll be showing is, though, less than perfect. I have several images of the piece, and the one that I'll be showing is by far the best one. Unfortunately, at the present time, the original work itself appears to be lost, meaning that no good image of the work can be located or made. Soweto, Guernica brought together two iconic works, referencing two markedly different 20th century murderous episodes of brutality and inhumanity. Guernica was one of those two images. The other was an image of Hector Peterson, a young South African schoolboy barely in his teens, who was the first school child to be shot and killed during the Soweto uprising of 1976, when South African police opened fire on Black students protesting against being taught in Afrikaans, considered by many Black South Africans as the language of apartheid itself, the language of degradation, the language of inferiority, and the language of subservience. The photograph acted as a major fillip to the anti-apartheid struggle, depicting as it did the barbarity of the apartheid South African state and its willingness to destroy Black lives, even the lives of children. In bringing together the two images, one, the famous large 1937 oil painting on canvas, which is once again the subject of our conversation, the other, a hugely influential and explicit photograph of white violence and Black death. Rodney created, in bringing these two images into one work, Rodney created a compelling dialogue between the two images, and also, just as importantly, a dialogue between himself as a Black artist and an art history from which practitioners such as he felt particularly excluded. So what we have in the work is one of many examples of the ways in which artists of color, artists of the African diaspora, reach into dominant strands of art history, reinscribing these works, oftentimes reinterpreting these works as a means of inserting themselves into an art history from which they are overwhelmingly absent. But there was, of course, so much more to Soweto Guernica than this. Rodney executed the work using discarded X-rays. Rodney suffered from sickle cell anemia, an inherited blood disease that is said to be more common in people with an African or Caribbean family background. The disease produces blood cells that do not live as long as healthy ones, and can block blood vessels and lead to other serious health challenges. As a sickle cell sufferer, which is a term used by those who experience sickle cell, as a sickle cell sufferer, Rodney spent long periods of time in hospital. It was in 1987, during one of Rodney's many protracted stays in hospital, that he began to use X-rays drawn from the hospital's discarded stock. These were freely made available to Rodney once any identifying markers were removed to ensure patient anonymity and confidentiality. Discovering these metaphorically powerful materials enabled Rodney to produce from his hospital bed unprecedented works of monumental scale, including Soweto Guernica. Rodney's use of X-rays as a raw material for his art was, in many respects, a stroke of genius. An X-ray is the means by which a surgeon sees illness or damage otherwise invisible to the naked eye. In the same way, only those so attuned can see beyond what might look like a society in pretty good shape to spot instead the frequently unacknowledged illnesses of racism, violence, and systemic state violence against Black people. And in the case of Soweto Guernica, the complicity of the British state in condoning the apartheid system, even though it destroyed Black lives. It was towards the end of the 1980s that Rodney produced a fascinating series of works that used X-rays. In making these works, Rodney asked many questions, including, of course, who sees racism, or who is blind to racism? While the history of Guernica is well known and has been further revisited in the exchange we're currently having, the history of the photograph taken by Sam and Zima is perhaps less well known. On the morning of 16th of June 1976, Black school children in the town or township of Soweto began a protest against being educated in Afrikaans, which, as mentioned, they regarded as a language which is inscribed them with inferiority. It is estimated that 20,000 students from schools across Soweto took part in the protests, which were met with unbelievable barbarity, with the full force of Africa's most militarized police force unleashed with extreme prejudice on protesting school children. The protests lasted several days, and by the time they ended, an estimated several hundred people, a great many of them school children, had been brutally killed. Many more were wounded and maimed. It was, though, the killing of Hector Peterson on the first day of the uprising that eclipsed all other killings of school children in the imagination of the sympathetic public beyond South Africa, a country fractured and tormented by apartheid. Of course, episodes of murderous brutality, including the killing of large numbers of unarmed protesters, was not new to South Africa since the introduction of apartheid in 1948. For example, we can consider the Sharpeville Massacre of 1960. In Soweto Guernica, Rodney places his version of Nzima's photograph at the center of Guernica, thereby creating an equivalence between the bombing of the Basque town in April 1937 during the Spanish Civil War and the murder of Black South African school children nearly 40 years later. Though it's not visible in the image I'm showing here, below Soweto Guernica, Rodney had installed a large panel, also made of X-rays, which read, "Guernica post-mortem, reclaiming the image, X-ray Soweto." Each of these sections of the title meant a great deal. Post-mortem or post-mortem examination is a noun with multiple meanings. On the one hand, it means the examination of a dead body to determine the cause of death. But a post-mortem can also be an analysis or a discussion of an event held soon after it occurred, especially in order to determine why it was a failure or why an event had gone wrong, or indeed, why an event had even occurred. All these readings apply directly to various aspects of Soweto Guernica. The other point I'd like to make, I'm almost done. I think I have just a few seconds left, so I'll be done by 1 minute past the hour, inside my 10 minutes. The other point I'd like to make is that Soweto Guernica was not the first time that Guernica had been put into explicit dialogue with a Black artist's work. You'll recall perhaps that it was used in the opening scenes of Julian Schnabel's 1996 film Basquiat. So what we have within these stills is we have, hidden in plain sight in many respects, a dialogue between the work of a Black artist and this historical reference of this of the iconic work, which is the center of our engagement now. Donald Rodney died in 1998, aged 36, from complications arising from his sickle cell anemia. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Chambers, for this fascinating presentation. I'd like to thank our panelists for their incredible lectures, which have advanced distinctive theoretical positions and perspectives in the debate on Guernica. At this point, we all should have a very good understanding of the canvas, one which allows us to position it in the context of the contemporary discourse that surrounds the Ukrainian war. And the bombing of Guernica was a trial run for the Nazi war machine. Britain's inadequate response to this callous act encouraged Adolf Hitler to proceed with his revisionistic plans. And the silence and inaction of the international community of the 20th century have been invoked by commentators as the Syrian and Russian regime relentlessly bombed rebel-held civilian areas of Aleppo. So just like Guernica became the herald of World War II, the bombing of Aleppo became the herald of the Ukrainian conflict and hopefully not World War III. Is it possible then to draw parallels between the bombing of Guernica and the bombing of today's Ukraine? Guernica brings to light an important message. Timely art informs and infuses the social narrative of war and frames our collective memory of history. What importance, therefore, does the canvas hold today after 85 years past the atrocity in Guernica? What gives it the power to transform passive bystanders into proactive participants of a public moral debate? These questions we shall try to attempt and answer during our discussion. Professor Mitchell, with which I was hoping to open discussion, you have perfectly addressed the question I had for you with your presentation, which was the quote from the symposium in Malaga. So I'm going to skip it as it has been answered and go directly to Professor Karmel. You have convincingly argued that to contemporary artists, the importance of Guernica's figuration or composition is inferior to the canvas's leading themes, which you discern as follows: lamentation of the victims of violence and preparing a memorial for victims of violence. However, considering that the above themes mark an evident departure from heroism, could it be that Guernica has been misappropriated as an inspiring symbol of political resistance and an embodiment of the pacifist ideology that emerged in the aftermath of World War II?
That's a big question. Thank you. I mean, it seems to me you've just mentioned two things that are somewhat contradictory between pacifism and the idea of resistance, which is, maybe in a purely pacifist way, but is often in the form of violence against violence. And it seems to me that the painting itself studiously does not take a position on that Picasso avoided voting for one response over the other. I'm about to repeat what I said earlier, that the key thing it focuses on is the distinguishing feature of absolute evil, which is not simply violence, but violence against the helpless, violence against civilians. And as I was saying earlier, I think that has marked a turning point in our perception of the conflict in Ukraine, from potentially seeing it as a power struggle amongst two powers to seeing it as a contest of good and evil. But as for the relevance of the painting itself, I wouldn't want to go all the way to saying that Picasso's imagery has no place anymore. I mean, Carolyn has shown us, the banners being carried by people in protests today, where the figures from the painting are very powerful symbols. But it does seem as though there's been a migration from the world of art or high art into the world of popular discourse. Everything could change tomorrow. Perhaps artists will come back to those forms tomorrow, but I don't see it as an important point of reference visually for contemporary art.
Thank you so much. On to the next question and a little context. If I may voice my view, according to me, Guernica does not celebrate victory. It celebrates the inverse, the total annihilation of the old order. It represents the shared experience of obliteration, which brings a social order grounded in the social contract between the state and its subjects to the brink of extinction. And so the erosion of the social contract ends this element of altruism between humans that exists in times of peace and stability, which instead transforms into selfishness, and which in political philosophy is customarily deemed as an essential quality for survival under very extreme conditions. So in a sense, the way I see it, Guernica shows a shift away from this collectivism and coexistence towards individualism. Because whether human or not human, the figures in the painting are separated and broken, which I see as suggesting the erosion of the society and its norms. But the current events in Ukraine present a different reality. And it's an inspiring image of resistance through unity. And so could it be that that this anti-war movement needs a new and revised symbol? And perhaps Guernica would be better suited during the process of political reconciliation. And that's a question to everyone. So
it's a very interesting question, Natalia. I'm not sure I have a really clear answer to it. I think the thing that makes it uncomfortable for me to bring Guernica to bear on Ukraine is two things. One is the bull, which I think is a kind of relic of Picasso's sentimentality about the bullfight as a ritual form of violence with a victim. And he has tried to adapt this to modern conditions where, as a ritual, the bombing of cities wasn't first time in Guernica. 1911, the Italians leveled towns in Ethiopia. And it goes on every year. So it is a kind of ritual of violence. And the bull, if that is the former victim in the corrida, the bull gets to be the spectator here, as if basically violence is just what modernity is. The other thing is the relation of the peace movement and the anti-war movement and anti-militarism. What use is Guernica to that movement right now? I still don't quite see it. It strikes me that Guernica verges on violence porn, just as the bullfight did. That we like violence. We watch it in the movies. We reenact it over and over again. And if you ask yourself, who is benefiting in Ukraine? Who's the major beneficiary of this? The US arms industry. They are making billions, shipping the latest weaponry into Ukraine. Of course, I feel ambivalent about that because I want Ukraine to survive. And so you say, this is exceptional. Ukraine is an exception to our anti-war, pacifist and anti-militarist. But I hope we don't forget this lesson in the midst of our moment, this strange, uncanny moment of moral clarity launched by this extraordinary man. Nobody expected, Zelensky to emerge as a global icon of resistance to violence, resistance to invasion. I just hope the next stage is one in which there is a ceasefire and the flow of arms and weapons and destruction can stop as soon as possible.
I do not see the bull as relating to the bullfight. Okay. The detail for me that leads me to that conclusion is its tail. I was very lucky because when I was writing my master's thesis, I got to see the painting all the time because it was at the Museum of Modern Art and I just had to take 2 buses. For me, that tail has always reminded me of the raft of the Medusa, of the guy at the top of the pyramid waving that piece of cloth. It's kind of magical. And I don't know, I have a couple comments. Basically, what did Picasso paint and how much can we read into it? Now, Picasso said very little about the painting. I guess I should have, I can't give you the quote. I think it's just like basically a sentence or 2. But when I was writing my master's thesis, I still had access to the stacks of the Museum of Modern Art library. And I took out every book, every biography that was conceivable of someone who might have visited Picasso while he was painting Guernica. And lo and behold, he might have said very little about the painting, but one day he left the studio. He went to the water closet and he took out a roll of toilet paper and he brought it over as if it was a piece of collage. And he put it in the hand of the bare-assed woman on the right, pretty much to say this, she was scared shitless. And if you match up the newspaper accounts of what Picasso was reading as he painted, even that warrior changes. At first, the warrior is almost a Christ-like figure, and his upraised arm disappears almost as soon as the airplane of General Mola was blown up in the air. General Mola had led the bombardment of Guernica, but the plane he was in was bombed, and all that was found was his head and his arms, or that's what we read. And I think very much we overinterpret the painting for our own purposes, that Picasso had individual elements in mind, like the figure on the left, the mother with the child. Humanité constantly, or almost immediately after the bombing of the town on Market Day, referred to women and children as widows and orphans. And you can account for all of these characters. And what we are doing is creating symbols that Picasso might not have agreed with. Personally, as soon as the Ukraine war started, I immediately thought of the Spanish Civil War, because of the helplessness of those poor children. I mean, who were bombed and they could read that it was children. So I think I listen to MSNBC every night at 11 o'clock to hear about the war, because I care very deeply about it. And to me, this painting just reminds me of the horrors of war. Thanks.
Thank you. If there's anyone else who would like to jump on this question, they can do it now. Otherwise, we can proceed to the next question.
Actually, I'll wait. Sorry. Go ahead, please, Natalia.
Okay. Okay, thank you. So this question is addressed to Professor Levitt. During the life in exile, traveling from one museum to the other, Guernica was often a target of vandalism. And after the United States' brutal involvement, and during as well, it has prompted the artist Tony Shafrazi to spray the words "kill lies all" over the painting. He argued that it was an act of political activism, one which was supposed to absorb the canvas into the present, repoliticize it, and recharge it for the new generation. Is it then time to recharge and prepare Guernica for it to become more pertinent simply to the Ukrainian conflict? And if so, how could we achieve this?
That's a really interesting question. Thank you. I think on one level, the graffiti is a really interesting point, actually. And it was fascinating to see that slide of that graffiti being cleaned off at the very beginning of this. And I think it's worth noting that actually that kind of slogan is something which has its life and then requires removal. I think that's an interesting fact in its own right, the place that graffiti has or perhaps doesn't have on the wall of the art museum. And I'm sure that if we were to leave all of the slogans that have been applied either directly to the canvas or over its surface, but not on its actual surface, then it would be covered in things that weren't there originally. So in some ways, I think Guernica has had so many layers added to it, either literally or in the way it's been invoked. And perhaps we've already seen that. Perhaps it has had its recharge. I think, like Tom, I'm slightly wary of overusing or overstating the relationship between Ukraine and Guernica. But I do think that absolutely Guernica has been used as a reference point by Zelensky, and that the way in which that worked and was possible was because it was such a recognizable motif. So as a recognizable motif, I think in a way it comes to us ready charged. And I think as my presentation sort of suggested, for me, that charged quality probably comes via the illegibility of the text. And in some ways, actually graffitiing a slogan across the surface of it in that literal way ties it down and almost kills it. And actually, it's the removal of that that then prepares it to be a page that is capable of being rewritten. So if Guernica needs to have a place in the current context, then I think it probably is important that it remains without any distinct writing literally applied to it. Perhaps it's in that retitling of it. Perhaps we change its name from Guernica to a town in Ukraine in our minds, at least. But I think for me, I think it's fully charged already. And I wonder if it's had its use in that cry for help that Zelensky used it as a recognizable motif that could be sort of claimed and targeted quite distinctly at a particular part of the world. And he used different recognizable motifs in his speeches to different countries. And I think that is quite key. It's very clever. We've thought about his eloquence already. And I think the eloquence of the picture is in its illegibility in that sense. I don't know if that answers your question or not, but it's a few thoughts on it.
It answers it brilliantly. Thank you so much. The last question is reserved for Professor Chambers. I wanted to ask whether Guernica's appropriation by artists fortifies its universal message in modern society, or does it instead distort the painting's original meaning intended to depict a very particular chapter in Spain's history?
Yeah, well, that's such a kind of that's a very kind of expansive question in so many respects. I mean, what I should say in the first instance is that there is a default framing of the work of Black artists as being primarily concerned with social narratives. It's over a very long period of time, stretching back maybe to the early part of the 20th century. We see the work of Black artists not read in terms of its artistic integrity, but read primarily for its social narratives. This is a major problem. This is a major challenge for many artists who find their work prescribed and pigeonholed and put into boxes where others who also have art school experience or training as artists are fortunate in many respects not to have their work kind of primarily read in terms of its social impulses. These are very difficult questions, of course, because at the same time, one can argue or one can understand the work of African diaspora artists as coming from spaces in which their life experiences, their histories, the ways in which they have ancestries that oftentimes reach back to Africa via the transatlantic slave trade. These elements do arguably inform the ways in which certain artists approach their art practices. But at the same time, you know, one has to be very, very wary of the ways in which one considers things in the political realm, in the wider social realm, and their engagement with artists, particularly artists of color. I mean, I would argue, I think, which I touched on very, very briefly in my paper, I would argue that what Donald Rodney is doing with his work, Soweto Guernica, is seeking to inscribe himself, seeking to find a place for himself in art history. Now, I know this is not your question. I know you didn't ask this question, but you know, I think much more than a consideration of the original painting itself, in many respects, even much more than a consideration of those awful murderous events in Soweto with South Africa in the mid-70s. You know, I think almost more than those things, what Rodney is doing is enacting a strategy which asks questions of art history. So, you know, I would offer that, you know, as a kind of an initial response to the question. And of course, the question is an expansive one that, were we to have time, we could certainly explore it in any given number of ways.
Absolutely, that very much answers my question. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Well, our panel talk slowly and sadly is coming to an end. And I hope that as a result of this comprehensive discussion that just took place, our audience will be able to have a much more complex understanding of the painting itself, but also to see it from a more contemporary perspective, one which links it back to not only the Ukrainian conflicts, but conflicts in general. And I will pass it back to Nick, who has access to our Q&A questions.
Absolutely. I'm overcome with how incredible these presentations and this conversation has been. And I want to sincerely thank you all so much for this today. We do have some questions from the audience, so we'll jump right into it. And very first, I'm going to pass the mic to Anita. Anita, you should be able to turn your mic on now.
I am now, and I want to also say how great it has been to listen to everybody's perceptions and insights about the painting, and the various takes and interpretations. And I want to introduce myself as an artist, and I don't know how many are familiar with the project that I did, but I'm going to briefly say that I lived under the World Trade Center in 9/11 and lost our apartment. And fortunately, we all survived, but I was one of the few artists to be invited to sit amongst the architects who were developing the very initial guidelines and ideas for the memorials at the site. And one of the things that struck me, having lived all overseas my whole life in different places, but being a native New Yorker, was the American flags on everybody's lapels and the lamenting and feeling of victimization from this event. I was very surprised by it. And long story short, looked for a website that might be www.guernica.com to see if there were any remnants of the bomb in the village. I happened to live in the Basque Country as a teenager and knew this area quite well. And I received what seemed like a message in a bottle back from the director of a peace and conflict resolution organization there. And 4 months later, I was flown over to the village of Guernica, and thus began a project that went on for 5 years, interviewing the survivors of the bombing, who were at that time, when I was brought over to the conference, like a bunch of very benign, nice old people in a room eating tapas. And I sat on a panel with people I didn't know, with simultaneous translation. And the woman next to me stood up and spoke in German and said to this group of benign looking older people that she had come to apologize. One of her father was one of the pilots who bombed the village. And the turn of mood in that room was palpable. These benign looking old people screamed at her and said, was it obligatory or voluntary? I should say that I'm bilingual, having lived there, but I don't speak Basque. Anyway, I am a visual artist. And at that moment, I thought, wow, what kind of poignance does that painting really have for these people? And do they even know about it? And does it matter? And I set forth on a journey of 5 years interviewing these people. This work became a sound and sculpture public art or installation at East Manhattan Plaza, I guess a year and a half, right down the street from the WTC after I did it. And it was a multi-channel installation at White Box. And later, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Krakow and the Museum of Art and Archaeology in La Paz, Bolivia, and in Beijing all showed this work and acquired it. I want to just say that I learned a tremendous amount, heard a tremendous amount of stories from everybody involved in my interviews. One of them relevant to what Phyllis Tuchman said about who knows how this was painted. Just these are just cute little anecdotes, and then maybe I'll show you just a few seconds of what one of the survivors said, because again, my interest was universality of survival, and more important to me was not what keeps us apart from one another, because I think basically all of this and all of us are tribal, and identity is really the problem. One of the few things that I learned, as I said, anecdotally about this was that Basque artists were fleeing the Basque country during the Spanish Civil War, went to Paris, and a wealthy guy at the time was obviously commissioned Picasso to do the mural. But before that, he actually was going to commission one of the Basque artists. And he was told that he had already fled to Mexico because they were scared to go back to Spain. So Picasso evidently was the second thought. And this was told to me by one of the artists actually who I met, who obviously all these people were in their 80s, but around to tell the story. The other was just, again, anecdotally, one of the people who if I can share the screen, I'll show you him. When I had asked him,
hey, Anita, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but we are going to have to move on to the next question soon. If you just want to sort of,
I won't show the video. I'll send a link so people can see it if they're interested. But just so you know that this really is about identity, which is terrible and the problem for everybody in the world historically forever. Is that the guy I interviewed? I asked if he'd ever seen the painting of Guernica, and he said he was shown it in the 1960s by the mayor of Prague, and it was on a stamp, a Czechoslovakian stamp. That's how he knew of the painting. And he said, and of course, we don't have bulls in the Basque country. That's a symbol of Spain. So, you know, this story behind Guernica never ends, never ceases to be fascinating. I agree with Mr. Karmel that we actually are doing this in other shapes and forms as artists. It's important to reconsider how we work as contemporary artists, but I think that this actually has an incredible longevity as a symbol, which is fascinating. And thank you everybody for this discussion.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Anita. I truly appreciate that addition to today's event. Next, I'm going to pass the mic over to Matthew Biro, and Rail Editor at Large in the audience. Matthew, you should be able to turn on your mic now.
Thank you so much, Nick, and to the whole panel for a really illuminating talk on the sorry, I'm out of breath. I just had to run and grab delivery from downstairs. They always come at the wrong moment. The whole panel for really an illuminating presentation on Guernica, really showing not only the power that it still has, but its very, interesting afterlife. I have a question about medium, in the sense that Guernica seems to be almost the last moment where that kind of large-scale historical painting can have the effect that it does. Maybe I'm wrong on that, so I bring that up as a question. And I'm thinking about how the kind of the rise of film video installation. I noticed in Pepe's talk when we bring it more into the contemporary moment, we go to Boltanski, that Turkish installation about the PKK. So we move into other media. And, when Carolyn was also talking about how Picasso is still referencing communications media, newspapers, photography. And when you're bringing all that in relation to, well, what does this mean about the current war in the Ukraine? There seems to be a very big difference to me, which is Guernica, people saw what was happening, but it was delayed, internationally, it was delayed. The information trickled in much more slowly. Today, it is so fast, it's instantaneous. You can, see things almost as they occur on Telegram and, all these other kind of apps, as well as in the mass media. So over the last, number of decades, we're seeing more and more political art that is using other media. And I'm thinking works like Arthur Jafa's Love is the Message is Death, or for another, critique of kind of the Turkish genocide of the Kurdish, you could think of Hito Steyrl's November. And in some ways, those media those works are mirroring the format of how we understand our world today more than I think painting does. So it's a general question. How do you think painting is surviving in today's world with all these other means of making politically resonant art?
It's one reason why I showed Luca Del Baldo's paintings of Putin, Zelensky, and the Russian patriarch. I think painting does something to the image beyond photography. These images, of course, were all first delivered on television, and particularly Zelensky's selfie was it was quickly circulated as seen again and again. So painting, I think, because it's a slower medium, it slows down perception as well. You look at the brushwork, you look at the surface, and so it encourages contemplation. Certainly, that's what it did to me when I put those two pictures of Luca's together, of the two handshakes. And it made me see something new. And I think that's what painting does, that often can carry it beyond photography.
Yeah, and I think just to kind of comment on that, I think for me, it's clear that painting is a deliberate choice as a medium in contemporary art. And I think it was in those works that you showed us at the beginning. And I think the idea of it slowing things down is absolutely essential. But when an artist today chooses to work in the medium of paint or chooses to work in the medium of tapestry, they are choosing a medium quite specifically for what it stands for what it represents and what it can do, counter to all those media which are there purely for mimesis or imitation, effectively. You can take a picture, you can do anything quickly if you want to report something. It's quite a different thing, and therefore very deliberate are. I think there are plenty of painters still working today. I think it's a very important medium for our times, but I think it's always a conscious choice.
I'd argue to some extent in contradiction that some of the images that play a similar role today have been, say, the photographs that played an important role in the Black Lives Matter movement, that there are certain images, and they do, I think, tend to be images of suffering that is clearly just, plain wrong, that, produce this, powerful effect on public discourse that's, that say, this is not a debate. This is not, what are the virtues of this side versus the virtues of that side. Something is just absolutely wrong here, morally wrong. And I mean, certainly painting can do that. And I mean, the photos Tom showed, the paintings, you see, there's the mistake. The paintings Tom showed, illustrate that painting can still play that role, but it does seem to me that it's mostly been taken over by photography and, images that are like sound bites, only they're visual bites.
Well, I want to thank you, Matthew, so much for your question and for your responses, everyone. We have just enough time for one more question. Before I go to that, I want to thank everyone that has shared a question in the chat, and I'll be sure to pass these along to our guests after this. But our last question today will come from the Rail's own Fong, who I believe is in a transitory moment. So I'm gonna see if, there you are, Fong. Passing it over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Natasha. Thank you, Phyllis. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Pepe, and everyone there tuning in. I've been listening here in and out. I apologize because I had a few meetings as I am driving and stopping here, so I'll be safe to just ask maybe one last question. Of course, I will need to go back and re-listen very carefully. But I was thinking in the very 1st of May, the first 4 or 5 sketches was made in one day, May 1st. And since I heard many of you have already talked about the bull as a symbol of bullfight, of masculinity and all of that, there's a relationship that always struck me very much, is the relationship between the horse and the bull. Particular in the last painting that Picasso had made on panel, or gesso white panel, where on the front, as I remember correctly, there's a profile of a horse in agony, and there's a cut in his stomach, whereas a smaller version of a Pegasus flying out. And I was thinking that very much because I remember talking to Ai Weiwei right after he was arrested when he first came to New York for his first show at Mary Boone. And he himself was not aware when I thought of him as the tankman at Tiananmen Square. In other words, in Asia, we don't really see an image of a liberated, individualistic symbolization of this young man trying to stop the advancing tanks in the most important in People Liberation Army. It occurred to me that it's a David against Goliath as a iconography, as an iconography, and I just realized that it's rarely happened in Asia. So my point was that in talking to him, I invoked a passage from the Book of Way, where it goes, if I remember correctly, it's been a while. Man enters, when he enters into life, he is weak and tender. When he dies, he becomes tough and strong. So that's why the tough and strong belongs to death, tender and weakness to life. So if our weapon is too strong, we will never be victorious. So it's very interesting in regard to Pegasus, because Pegasus is born out of the Medusa's blood, infused with earth, which is Gaia. Therefore, it became the symbol of strength and valiant and whatnot. I just don't understand the context with that such complexity when he put Pegasus being flown out of that dying horse right next to the bull. What does that say in the end of Picasso's interest in psychic automatism? I think that's a very interesting thing about how he came in and out of his own interest in surrealism. So can any of you further this inquiry, Picasso and psychic automatism, essentially?
Carolyn?
Yeah, so Picasso was very interested in surrealism. He was sort of what we might think of as a fellow traveler of the surrealists. He read all their journals. He was published in several of them. He refused to join either of the surrealist groups, Bruton's group or Bataille's group. I think I missed slightly how you meant that the Pegasus was related to psychic automatism. I think Picasso was the kind of artist who wasn't so interested in that sort of Freudian side of things. He was very interested, though, in the dislocation of motifs, for example, the dislocation of two things that you could put together to create something unexpected and new. And I think his collage process, the sort of cut and paste effect, was very much at the heart of what surrealism was later able to do via metaphor, whether that was linguistic or whether it was visual. So I think Picasso was very interested in the use of metaphor or metonym, sort of visual metaphor, and all of those visual word plays, bomba, bombilia, for example, is a very sort of surrealist mode. So yes, I think there is definitely something there. I'm not sure if I fully understood how you meant that the Pegasus related to that, but I do think that the Pegasus is sort of an ambiguous symbol which combines two things together, which perhaps are unexpected, is absolutely relatable to surrealism and to surrealism's interest in myth, for example. I don't know if anybody else has a better response to that or wants to develop that at all.
I don't have a Pegasus, but I could, if I could just show you one picture from shortly before Guernica. I think, I hope that's visible.
Mm-hmm.
This, I think, takes Cubism, merges it with a kind of surrealism. And to me, I cannot look at Guernica without the memory of this composition, which shortly precedes it, a period in which Picasso was exploring this motif. And what does it, and so I stand by my association of the painting with ritualized violence, violence as a spectacle staged in which real death occurs. And here, of course, it is the death of the horse at the hands of the bull. Guernica says the horses and all of us are swept up. And the bull stands aloof. The bull is the bull us watching? Are we the witness figure within the picture? Lots of questions, but I cannot get it out of my head. I know some people, Tim Clark said, the bull is just a bull, get over it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and to that I say, Tim, bullshit. So anyway, I'll stop sharing and let me.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you. No, but I was thinking also because there's an image of Para that you didn't quite have enough time to get into it. The commission which he made for the ballet, Caroline. I was thinking about that too, the continuity of the germination of the image itself. Mm-hmm. So the reason I brought it up because not long ago, I went back and reread Calvino's Sic Memos for the Next Millennium, in which the second chapter, I think, is dedicated to the notion of likeness, which is so interesting in Perseus avoiding to turn stone, knowing that anyone who look at her gaze will be a case of death. He then borrowed the shield of Athena, and it was the reflection of the shield that he able to slay her head off. So that's where it launched out to this whole idea of conquering darkness by lightness, the whole idea of good and evil. So I was thinking in that context why Pegasus, born out of the blood of evil, but it represents lightness, so to speak.
Yeah. And I think certainly for Picasso, Pegasus becomes a symbol of sort of hope, symbol of rebirth, symbol of peace. Absolutely. And interestingly enough, as a kind of link to surrealism, that curtain for Parade with the Pegasus on it was at the very basis of Apollinaire's first use of the term surréalisme. He said that Parade, with combinations of different modes and different figures, represented une sorte de surréalisme, a sort of surrealism. So it's quite an interesting sort of circular loop, I think, this recurring Pegasus image. Thank you.
Thank you.
If I can jump in here, I know we're going to have to shift gears in a moment because I'm eager to hear our concluding poems, but I do want to say something about José Lebrero Stals, who was supposed to join us today and was apparently had technical difficulties. He's the director of the Museo Picasso Malaga, and it was his idea to have the original seminar on the afterlife of Guernica. So really, if people haven't, enjoyed our discussion today, it is very much thanks to him and his inspiration roughly a year ago. So if you're out there somewhere, José Lebrero, please accept our thank you.
Yes, and if I may just jump in on this, and the original recordings from the Malaga symposiums are available on their official website, the website of the Museum of Malaga. So if you're interested in these conversations and you'd like to see the full version of them, you can easily find them online.
If I may cut in, thank you, Fong, for that question. Thank you for your responses. Fong, drive safely.
Thank you.
I can't express how excellent this event has been today and how grateful I am to all of you for joining, to Jose in absentia, and to everyone, again, for your questions that we weren't able to take. Thank you for sharing those. I will pass them along to our guests after this, but it is our tradition, as mentioned, here at the Rail, to close with a poetry reading, and I'm very pleased to welcome to the stage today our poet laureate, Sarah Heady, sorry. Poet and essayist Sarah Heady is interested in place, history, and the built environment. She's the author of Comfort from forthcoming 2022, Corduroy Road from Dancing Girl 2021, and Niagara Transnational from 14 Hills in 2013. Raised in New York's Hudson Valley, she lives in San Francisco, where she co-edits Drop Leaf Press, a small woman-run poetry collective. And you can see a full bio for Sarah in the link in the chat, but Sarah, over to you.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. Am I the poet laureate of this event? Is that what I was supposed to understand? Okay, I happily accept that title. Thank you all so much for your really important and in-depth work that you shared today. It was a pleasure, and I'm honored to be here. And I'm going to read some pieces from my book, Comfort, which is coming out this year from Spite and Dival Publishing in New York. I remembered to cover up the mound today, began my ambulatory, stopped at the pile of bones I've seen so many times I don't see it anymore. And the fire opened the pine cone. The boiling water opened the mouth of the shell. The feet and hands tangled together in a victual net. Rolling hill of the body's cold forelegs. You are a child hemorrhaging me. The growing hedge is useless for some years, during which time it needs protection for itself. I've come too close to leave my pasture full of investments behind. I'm waiting for sound to stop. Ate the barnyard's wild onions alone. Now I have subjectivity and you have nothing. I tried to share the bed hanging by chain from the wraparound porch, but the sun will keep you company. I'll cut you a third eyelid, then you'll see my adoration plain as morning, plain as the mess of hair you culled from the setter. A makeshift place to hold the fire, a mysticized study of pain. Sun disappears, but the song stays, the heat stays. Severity of how you see me, the love somehow of a life in which we look for lost objects, in which the last lost objects belong to us. Watched a fire jump the break, opened the window to black exhaust, cooked a meal forward and backward, without urgency scraped the crumbs onto the floor, made a paste of the crumbs and the wall's condensation, applied it to the lock on his door. There was a list of the ways, and I read it to him outside the shelter belt at the property line in the purple room of dusk. I can only say there is what you know and what I know, and those things may never converge in the field I want them to. And here a worn ottoman interrupting the perfect length of the rug. Elsewhere languages spoken in the L. Light shines butter crass on blue snow. Question crumbling whether men or women make better choices. And you find an extra fold of space in the pocket of world and label it me and this, calm eyes when you tell me about the frame around our pocket world, the net worth of my actions, nothing, and I am the last one to swallow the earth in this house, a hard clod, empty, the hands, the sockets, the mouth of all hope. I'll catch up with you later. So some things just don't go anywhere. They fall to the side of the purple road. I walk in a scarf line through untold color, and I can forgive myself. And sing me a way of being close to me without being inside me. My blue self is quiet, and my blue self is quiet and waiting for my red half to return. But you won't slow down to see death's purple mergings. You won't see a new life for the field. The ditch deepens each season, an undertow in a stone room, steeped in burning lavender. Lock yourself out once, I'll let you in. Twice, I can't do this anymore. Everything is change in the valley of summer. The conflagration is me. If you love this body, let it go into sedge, into blue stem, in search of tall ships and their anchors. Anchors hold down the roof of our house, oxidized prisms that mimic true north. And a ways out, I watch the blonde wood get relief from the winter sun as it sets. Please leave me here to heal. Leave me here wanting more. In a circle of purple sky, in the circle we built together. I turn on the light and living things scamper off the world's edge. Let it be, sings the one that stays behind. But I smell the wind. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for that beautiful reading to conclude today's event. And I encourage everyone to check the chat for some links to Sarah's work. I just once more want to thank you all so much. Thank you, Hedy, Pepe, Jose in absentia, Caroline, Tom, and Phyllis. An immense amount of thanks goes to Natalia for really being the person that organized all of this today. And an extended thank you to Joaquin Pizarro, who was a person that was part of the genesis of this event today. So thank you all. We encourage everyone to view our archive of these conversations on our YouTube channel, where we will upload today's conversation shortly. And join us on Monday at 1 p.m. for a conversation with artist Richard Hawkins and Rail contributor Andrew Woolbright on Hawkins' current exhibition titled The Forest Bess Variations at Green Naftali. We will conclude with a poetry reading by Patrick Hill. You can now all turn on your microphones to say hello and goodbye. And I hope you all have a very good weekend. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Nick.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Sarah, for the poem.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you all.
Natalia. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pepe.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Right, thanks, Pepe.
Thank you all so much,
Take care.
Sarah. I
Really
was
been
yelling in
amazing.
the office.
Thank you, Pepe. Thank you. Thank you, Tom. Thank you,
Thanks,
Caroline.
Tom. Thanks, Nick.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for
Okay.
joining.
Thank you,
Can't wait to
everyone.
listen.
Have a good weekend. Bye.
Bye.
Yeah, have a great weekend. Much love and courage.
Love and courage. Thank you all. Take care.
Thank you, Nick. Bye.
Bye.